Well, good day. I've just been doing what I've been doing all along the last, what would you call it? I don't know how long it's been, about 6 months now that I've been essentially doing my podcast into AI, then allowing it to expand on things that I drop that, needs expansion, adjust what I'm saying, adjust for clarity, blah, blah, blah. But what's interesting? When I go through this podcast, you'll understand why this is such a surprise. 3 or 4 years ago, I was functionally illiterate. And I was smart, right? I was an ex-banker, educated in many ways, but everything I learned I had to listen and retain. I really couldn't read, right? I could read basic stuff, but you give me a textbook, I couldn't make heads or tails of it. But fast forward to today. So that is the reason for today's podcast. It's, once again, I've actually spent probably about 5 hours in Grok. I know a lot of people hate X, but I'm sorry. I'm trying to save our humanity here. So I will use whatever tools are available. I'm trying to help us to get over this malaise, get past this, inability to read and function, and this is what AI does for me. So what I did is we've actually gone through, I've had to bring it up to speed, right? I've been using ChatGPT for years, so I've had to bring Grok up to speed on where I'm at, who I'm at, and all that. So today we've been talking about a few things. It's really quite a number of things we've been talking about, because literally I've been talking and reading back, and we've been going back and forth with AI, and I'm not exaggerating, 3 or 4 hours at least, if I'm not mistaken. It seems longer than that. And like ChatGPT, I've asked Grok to tell me what it thinks is the best. But unlike Grok has done so much better than ChatGPT, because ChatGPT, Grok makes mistakes because it misunderstands or mishears what I say, because voice to text. ChatGPT would lie. The amount of hallucinations in ChatGPT was mind-boggling. So when I did my script with ChatGPT, I had to tell it everything. And then I'd have to go through and make sure where it made mistakes. But here in Grok, it's fabulous. It made a little mistake here and there, but all I have to do is push back, and it will realize its mistake and go forward. But neither here nor there. So, on that note, let me begin with a new podcast. So, from illiterate to insight, the dyslexic learning protocol that beats PhDs. Hey, it's me, it's Al. Welcome to the podcast. Today's story starts with me busting a money laundering ring at a bank, goes through me teaching myself to read, and ends with a protocol that'll make you smarter than a room full of PhDs. This is from illiterate to insight. Okay, let's go. 2001. I'm an investment advisor at the bank. Not TD. A different bank. Not the one that just paid $3 billion in a fine for money laundering. But at this bank, I was, as I said, a finance manager, investment advisor. Silly titles. None of them really made any sense. But I was no longer operating on the bank side, the finance, the numbers, the day-to-day banking. I was purely investments and finance, financial planning, that sort of stuff, mutual funds, that sort of jazz. So I had nothing to do with the day-to-day banking. So right now it was later than 2001. I think it was 2003, 2004. The AI made a mistake in the script. I mentioned the 2001 money laundering legislation. That's when it first came out. But I think this was later because there was an update that came out. And I think this was around the time when the first update came out. So I'm thinking 2003, 2004. And so I hadn't had the direct money laundering training at that point. The managers all did. I think the service manager did. So what happened is that I moved from up north to a new branch. And so I'm working in this branch in southern Ontario, in a tourist area. And supposedly they've been working on this for quite a while. And when I had joined the bank, the service manager, who was young, something like me, she kind of saw, hey, well, actually what's even funnier, the reason why she learned to come to me is, and this is how far I've gone, I no longer could do this. I would freak out if it happened nowadays, just lose my mind. But back then I was a different person. And what she did is, when I first started with the bank, I had to have my background check done. And so she did my RCMP background check, and she came back to me and she all embarrassed, and she's like, "Oh, John, your background check came back negative." I'm like, "Yeah." Because, I've had them before, right? And I didn't know the verbiage, right? So I didn't put, the way she was speaking and her demeanor, kind of assumed she was trying to imply that there was something wrong. So I got up and went to her and said, "There's nothing wrong. I don't even have a ticket in my background." And I didn't even think of it. I actually have, my name has, abnormal spelling, and for that reason my name always gets messed up. In the Canadian government, they even mess up my birthday. I have to get that fixed every few years. I have to, depending on what division of the government I'm dealing with, sometimes it'll have an apostrophe, sometimes it won't, which means it makes it difficult for me. Imagine what I think's happening is these government workers are either creating an account with or without the apostrophe, and there's multiple accounts and they're selecting it, or they're not. If it's a system with both my name with and without the apostrophe, they're selecting one or the other, or worse, if it is with or without, right? Because that just happened to me on elections, right? My wife went up to, and just shows you how terrible people are. My wife and I both went up to the electoral people at the same time. The lady that was helping my wife, no problem, found her right away. She didn't have to mention the apostrophe. But the guy that was helping me, I'm still standing there. My wife's gone. And this guy is still messing in his computer. He's like, I can't find you. And so I said, well, my name has an apostrophe, so it might be with or without. And the lady next door heard. And she pipes up and she goes, "No, it's with." So imagine this idiot. Oh, that was mean. I don't mean to say that, but imagine in this day and age, right? We try to argue that. Oh my God, the women. I worked in a bank. I gotta be honest. Except for minor little things, women really are better than we are in a lot of ways. But I digress. So what happened is the service manager came up to me. And she says, hey, she'd already run this past the manager. She says, "Hey, there's this tiny motel, shipping millions overseas. Manager says it's cool. I don't like how he scripted it." She just came up to me and she said, "Hey, can I run this past you?" She's like, I told the manager and he doesn't think it's a problem. Supposedly she was so adamant about it, made him drive by. He still said no problem. But again, I think she was like me, neurodivergent, and I think she really saw it as a problem. She just couldn't figure out why. So she came to me and just plain and simple said, "Hey, what do you think of this?" So I asked her, how big is the motel? How much cash? She tells me, and I'm like, no, that's obvious money laundering. They need 1,000 rooms to pull off that legitimately. The manager let it slide for years, even after the 9/11 laws, and then an update on it. I don't know why. 2 minutes, I call it. We shut it down. Motel's gone. The RCMP took it from there. Probably some dark stuff, terrorism, who knows. Point is, I saw the pattern when they didn't. So, how? I'm dyslexic. Reading's a war. But I'd been hammering audiobooks. Over 1,000 hours on Audible alone in just the last couple of years. 2 times speed, long books, rereads. That's just the start. Hundreds of gigs of local audio. I use Libby, Scribd, YouTube, Hoopla, you name it, all of the apps. 80, hundreds of titles, maybe more, finance, systems, whatever. And that's just in a few months, to be honest. I, on average, read about a book a day, a book every 2 days now. For a couple of years, I was doing a book or 2 a day. But finance, systems, I wasn't glued to the screen. I was wiring my brain to see. But back then, I wasn't reading. I was consuming audio. But they gave me shit for pacing at work because I didn't like to sit in front of that darn computer. They wanted me parked reading memos. No, I crushed it on the phone with clients, right? Spotting the bull cocky, like that motel scam. But if they had their way, I would have been sitting there with my face in the computer and nothing would have come. So want to name a bank, audiobook. Oh, sorry, this is a prompt. My glasses aren't on. It says, want to name an audiobook that clicked for you, something that primed you for that bust. No, nothing. When I came into the bank, this is what I didn't tell the AI. Not only did I already have my mutual fund certification, which is not common, I also had the Canadian Securities Course certification. So I was not only I could sell stocks for people, I could act as a stock analyst because of the training I had. And by the way, the professor that taught me said I was the most excellent student that he'd ever come across. I had a better grasp on it in college than professionals that he knew. And I've mentioned this before. When I worked at the bank, most bankers don't know any of the stuff they were taught, right? What's a return on equity, a return on investment? They don't know any of that. So they have to look up the formula. So they can't read a prospectus and then know already, just by looking at it, what's off, right? For me, I can do that. In fact, recently, I got caught on it because I went in someplace, they overcharged me. I knew there was something wrong. I checked the bill, but I didn't look hard enough because of embarrassment, because we were hot. But I was right. We got overcharged. Just an absolute stupid error. But this is this mind that can see patterns in the chaos. I talk about this. The mind is a predictive matrix. We can all have this superpower. We can all look into the chaos of our everyday life, of the future, and we can see the patterns. We can see our path within. And that's the lesson that I'm trying to teach today, right? So the real deal here is I couldn't read growing up. Technically, I was illiterate. Dyslexia made books a brick wall. I mean, there were some books that I was able to get to, but they had to be small, they had to be simple. And what I've learned in my old age, the paper had to be the right color, the lighting had to be right, the font had to be the right shape, right size. That's the only books that I could read. And even then, I remember one of the first books I read was an ElfQuest novel, and it took me a long time, but I read it. And here's what's interesting. I was able to get over what most people, I think, do. I didn't skip past pages that I had forgotten what I read. I went back and read it, and I slowed myself down because I can read very fast, right? Because of my dyslexia, I can recognize words by sight. But that is not this deep reading that we're supposed to do. That skimming is closer to Maryanne Wolf's idea of what reading is today, right? So, my parents dragged me to allergists, not educators. Carpets stayed, shots didn't fix it, school, forget it. But I found audiobooks. I started with, well, for me, it was actually, I found out about audiobooks because I actually volunteered to read for the blind, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. I was too young. They didn't really want anything to do with me. But what I found out was audiobooks, right? So from then on out, going to the library, it was audiobooks I was looking for. Right? So like in Buddhism, right, there's lots of audiobooks. So maybe that's why I got so interested in Buddhism, right? Because it's often a verbal thing. But I was hooked from then. Right? It took me years, but I cracked it. Now I've got hundreds of physical books, hundreds, marked up. I have a dozen Bibles marked up so that I could learn, as Northrop Frye said, the Great Bible Code, or as Nietzsche, so I can read Nietzsche and read Jung, or now I can remember what the meanings are and I can explain it for people. Imagine. So, it took me years. I'd listen first, then read. Makes the slog easier. That's my protocol. Audio, text, speed it up 2-3 times. That's not true, but my protocol is listening to a book first, audio, then reading it while listening to it. Because then when you go to read it, it makes it so much easier because you know the content. You already know a lot of this stuff because I personally think audio is the way we're meant to, as Maryanne Wolf says. we have to add on this skill of reading. We're not natural readers, but we're natural listeners. We're natural storytellers. I mean, I'm Irish. It's literally what we are. It's our gift, right? So what the AI was getting at is I listen to books at 2 and 3 times speed, but I've been doing this for years, decades, maybe even. So I started listening like most people at 1 time speed. Your average Audible listener, less than 2%. I can't remember the exact figures, so we'll say 3%. Less than 3% of Audible listeners listen faster at a higher speed than 1 time speed. And when you remember that almost all audiobooks are shipped slower than the speed at which they were read, is it any surprise people can't pay attention? I mean, how many people will admit slow talkers just lose their interest or frustrates them? And yet, we're shipping audiobooks filled with slow talkers. It makes no sense to me. So that's just a little insight into the protocol. We'll get to it later. Silence. What can I do? So, I move on. There's my seeing words. I just looked at science and read silence. Talk about dyslexic brain, eh? I gotta hold the phone away from my head so I can read with my bifocals. Welcome to being a dyslexic with Erland syndrome and astigmatism. Life is not easy, but here's what I find happens. It's like the early Zennies taught you breathing as the shortcut to meditation. Well, honestly, dyslexia, astigmatism, Erland lens, all of those are a forced focus. So I'll go on. Science backs this. Dual coding from Alan Pavio. The brain has 2 lanes, verbal, words, and nonverbal. Images, sounds. Hit both, it sticks. Text plus audio, double the hooks. Actually says 20 to 40% better comprehension and retention. I found this. I found his textbook at a thrift store. Canadian guy, forgotten gem. I push it further. Crank the speed to challenge yourself 2 times when it's easy, 3 times when you're ready. Slow down if it's dense. It really does matter, the author, right? So you have to adjust it for every book is what I was trying to explain to AI, and it doesn't understand that, right? Again, I've got to 2 and 3 times speed because a lot of books, these people talk so slow. You can go to 3 times speed and still understand. Like, listen to me talking right here. This is normal speed. This is how I talk normally. Oftentimes even faster. And that's what happened. Not only, like I used to talk a lot, but I didn't talk fast like this. But worse yet, I had a hard time organizing my thoughts and I'd forget what I was talking about, but that doesn't happen anymore. I can talk for hours and hours and hours, and I can connect from the first thing I mentioned to the last thing. All because of this dual coding and pushing yourself. Not leaning on your skills, but pushing into that fear, right? So reread. Once ain't enough. That's Mortimer Adler, right? Or as Max Mueller said, if you only have one religion, then you have none at all. So I argue, if you've only read a book once, you haven't read it at all. Kids should pair up. Kind of like the way the young Hasidic students learn. They pair off against each other. Or the Buddhist Geshe, the PhD, they actually pair off and fight. They argue to try to understand each other, right? Sophistry is not evil. If you can steel man your opponent, well, you can understand their position better and thereby understand your own position. That's Martin Buber's I and thou, right? If you treat people as an it rather than another I, another thou, if you discount another person's opinions, their thoughts, their feelings, any of that is denaturing their humanity, and thereby you're denaturing yourself. Because what truly makes any great idea awesome is to challenge it, right? That's what I always was taught was philosophy, was science. It's to try to disprove your own idea, not avoid other people who would, right? But I digress. Right? So the idea is more voices, more different voices. It actually can cut through that cognitive dissonance. I ran into that in the bank. Most of the people I work with couldn't understand anybody with a strong accent on the phone. Because again, that dissonance gets worse when it's on the phone and when there's kind of a disconnect. And I mean, gosh, had that ever gotten worse? Because the bank early went to internet telephony. And so, oh my God, it got so much worse. But because of my dyslexia, I guess, or whatever, my pattern recognition brain, that never fazed me. I was able to understand some of the worst accents you just wouldn't believe. I tie it even to my dyslexic brain. They say the dyslexic mishears phonemes. And I think what I've done is I've allowed myself to mishear those phonemes, because they told me when I was in high school, when they finally diagnosed me at the very end of my high school career, diagnosed me with dyslexia. They said, oh, we really screwed you over by putting you in the French immersion. But there you go. There's another major mistake. They are so wrong. It was my dual language, this code switching, that allowed me to overcome all this. So my French, when I started, was really good. It was way better than all the English kids that I went to school with. So as a result, I didn't speak much French. As that progressed, my spoken French kind of stayed where it was, so I just didn't speak it all that much. But I was so fluent, I could understand, right? And I could understand them speaking English in class and the teacher speaking French, and I could respond back in English. I had no problem with that, right? But fast forward to today, and I think it's that fast code switching that's allowed me to jump between, right? Because the hardest thing for us to do, I did a podcast about this, the polyglot paradigm idea, that really, truly, we can only have a couple languages properly at any one time. Otherwise, it's, just barely like how much Spanish I speak, grade 10 Spanish. I know Latin and French. That doesn't make me a Spanish speaker, right? So what I was saying is more voices allows you to understand them better. I hear a lot of people complain about LibriVox. LibriVox is on Audible now. They're putting LibriVox books on Audible. So these people that say that the quality is lowered is ridiculous. The only thing that's different is they have different voices, different accents. They'll have someone from Wales or with a Scottish accent or an Indian accent. I think I told you this. There's one book that I couldn't get. I think it's the log of, don't quote me. But there was one book that there was no audio available except one guy, an Indian guy. And you could hear the birds squawking and even monkeys screaming in the background when he's doing the audio, but really hard to stay focused on. But what I learned is by forcing my way through that, I actually have the focus of Job, right? I really do at this point, because none of that bothers me, right? But see, this is the thing. I was an opposite when I was a kid. If I did a test in class and a fan was on, that's all I could hear, right? Doing a test with pencils, I heard everyone's pencil scratching on the paper. I couldn't separate that from. So I think this is what people miss with this idea of recognizing phonemes. I think the dyslexic is that we can't parse the noise, the signal for the noise. So we hear everything. And so what we have to do is not code switching, but it's decoding the sounds to find out what is perspectival, necessary, salient, and what is just noise, right? So that's where I'm at. So another problem, any physical book you've marked up, like Nietzsche's notebooks, that shows this in action? Well, yeah, actually, one of the first books I ever purchased, retail, was Nietzsche's The Spig Zarathustra. It's an interesting story, though, because the first book I ever got was it was almost free. It was like 10 cents or 25 cents at Alice and the Bookman in North Bay, Northern Ontario, one of the largest used bookstores in the world. That's what they say. But it was actually an early edition, and I've picked up an edition, the exact same edition, in the last couple of years from the first book that I ever got of Nietzsche. It's the compilation of his Genealogy and Morals and The Birth of Tragedy. Golding, I think, is the translator, but don't quote me. It's a blue, kind of bubbly cover, paperback, and it just cracks in half. So mine did 30 years ago. This one did as well. It was perfect when I first got it, but then when I opened it, it cracked open. That was my first book. Right? Young kid learning about trauma. Perfect. But the Genealogy and Morals, that was perfect, man. I loved it. But here's what's crazy. Genealogy and Morals shouldn't be read before you read Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. right? Because that's a bookend. That book is probably for a college course where they're just giving people an idea of a philosopher's first work and one of their last, right? One that they discounted themselves. Nietzsche's like, no, I was wrong. Forget that, my birth of tragedy stuff. I was wrong. But his genealogy and morals, that stuff is gold, and we're still learning what we can learn from that, right? So for me, it really did its job, right? Reading that Nietzsche book, his first and his last, it made me love his philosophy. So when I went to the Coles bookstore, there's a little Canadiana for you. When I went to Coles, the bookman, the only Nietzsche they had was Thus Spake Zarathustra. So to read it, I had to carry it around. So you remember I told you that story about professor who carried around the Communist Manifesto? Well, picture me. I was in my teens, carrying around Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. No, I was lucky, because almost no one knew who or what he was at the time, but I actually still have that book. Not only did I mark it up, but I wrote some poetry in it. Imagine an illiterate, dyslexic kid writing poetry. It's silly, it's cringe, it's simple, it's basic, it's not very prose-worthy, but it certainly does have a voice. And that's what my teachers told me. They told me I wrote with a unique voice. They didn't teach me how to write to be understood, but they said it was a unique voice, right? So, how did that fall? What does that have to do with what I'm talking about? Well, actually, it's how I got out of basic grade 10 English and got led into grade 13 or OAC, what's university prep courses in college. How? Well, because one of my French teachers in the general class that they put me in because they assumed I wasn't smart, one of those French teachers was actually a Spanish teacher, and she lied about me to the school, telling them that I was disruptive. And you know what it was? It's because my French was better than hers. And I corrected her. Just once. I corrected her on a mistake she made. I just wasn't paying attention. I shouldn't have. And that really made her mad. So she tried to get me kicked off of the football team. And, well, that's when the coach told me that she just hates him and hates the football team. So I stood up for myself and I said, no, she's lying. And so the football coach, really smart, I guess, because he knew me, because I was actually dual. I was like French immersion. So at this point in high school, I was taking half English, half French. So he was my football coach, but 100% English. He was teaching me accounting and business. So he knew me, right? And, well, he wanted me to stay on the football team because I was a pretty darn good lineman. But what he did, rather than just going to her and saying, yeah, I know you're wrong, back off, he wanted her to be brought up on the carpet for constantly trying to get kids kicked off of the football team and bad-mouthing him. So what he did was he told them and said, hey, listen, you might not believe me, but let's just see what happens. So they actually allowed her to set her own trap. So they allowed her to think that she was getting me in trouble and yada, yada, yada. On the back, I didn't know what was going on. He just told me, let me deal with this. And didn't have it. He said, don't have anything to do with her. Don't antagonize her. Just keep away from her. And he said, I'll sort this all out. So what he did is he made her push this, right? Kind of like Hacksaw Ridge with the courts martial of Desmond Doss, because he refused to pick up a rifle. Same idea. So she thought she was coming there to get me in a bunch of shit for being, but it all came out because, plain and simple, the vice principal just asked her, he said, you do understand that this guy probably speaks more French than you do. And just the look on her face, her mouth just dropped. And so they just went in on her and said that, you have a pattern of this, blah, blah, blah. So they just, it was just the funniest. So yeah, needless to say, I stayed on the football team. I was given an A for her class. I didn't have to finish the class, obviously. And because of this, I don't know why, I guess it was so poor of how I was treated, they allowed me to go from the grade 10, 11 general courses that I was in to get my high school diploma. Remember, the rest of my credits were French immersion, advanced, and, but it was because I wasn't diagnosed with dyslexia. That's why, right? I wrote my aptitude test the way Seaver what was his, not Ben Seaver, that was his younger brother. Mike Seaver from, not Growing Pains, the Hogan family, Seavers. No, I'm just confusing it all. There was a TV show back in the day where the kid just drew pictures in the little, balls, A, B, C, D. So I skimmed the test. I wrote it in about 30 seconds, 2 minutes. But they just pigeonholed me forever on that. And why it was most troublesome is, well, even just going 5 minutes on it, I don't know, by luck or whatever it was, I actually scored average, right? So I didn't show as above or below average. So they just ignored me, right? So they told me I could take these OAC courses if I convinced the teachers to teach me. So some of the teachers that knew me from French immersion had no problem letting me in because they knew I was not what they thought I was. Some of my friends who were French immersion but were, like, what would you call it, exceptional students, put in some good words for me with some teachers. Some of my teachers I had no problem getting into, right? Like my biology teacher knew, I'm sure he knew I was dyslexic, and he knew I was a little traumatized kid that, I was just, what would you call it, a product of my environment. So he had no problem with me. But what I was really adamant to get into is we had a grade 13 English teacher who had a PhD, and she got her PhD under Northrop Frye, a very famous Canadian that I've talked about. And she taught her class, revolved around literature and art, and she's really ahead of the curve on this stuff. Right? She taught from Northrop Frye's Educated Imagination, but we also read, I can't even remember. We read Tale of Two Cities, and we read Heart of Darkness. We read 2 different Shakespeare plays. Like, she had us reading stuff constantly, and I had a hard time because I did the same thing I did in French class. I just listened, and I was able to do just as well as most of the kids by just listening. But before I even got in the class, I had to go to her and talk to her about this. And she intimidated me because the kids that went to her class were all the high value, high aptitude kids. I was just a South End bum, poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks who obviously wasn't all there, right? But I just got up the nerve to go and talk to her. And I didn't even think about it, but I, as I told you, would carry around my Thus Spake Zarathustra everywhere. And so it was in my left hand as I was talking to her. And I don't know if she recognized or saw it, but she asked me what it was, and I just held it up to her. And here's a funny thing, too, because the translation I had was my favorite. It's R.J. Hollingdale's, and the title is Thus Spake Zarathustra. And so I thought she was making fun of me when I held it up and I said, Thus Spake Zarathustra. She said, Thus Spake. I'm like, what? Oh, like, I assumed she was making fun of me. In reality, what I think it was, is I think she was thoroughly impressed. That not only was I reading this, but she could tell that I was just tearing it up, right? I can't remember if I let her look. I think I let her look at it, and she could see that I was, marking it up, and I never even thought of it. She may have seen some of my writing in there. So she let me in the class, and I think I became one of her favorite teachers. Because, I think she loved the fact that, I really saw things differently, right? So that was my start in philosophy, believe it or not. I fell in love with Nietzsche's Zarathustra. But where it really hit home for me was the Chinese Book of Change, the I Ching. Again, same weird story. She went into Kohl's one day waiting for my mom to finish work in a mall. She worked in a bank, right? I've been in a bank all my life. And so I just wandered around, and I loved books, even though I couldn't read them so well. But I found this book called The Chinese Book of Change. This big book. No one bought it. So Kohl's used to produce these cheap versions of hardcovers. They sell for fairly cheap, like 15 or 20 bucks as opposed to 25 or 30. I'm just equivalent. Back then it was nowhere near that much. But then when they didn't sell, they just put them on for almost nothing. So this book of the I Ching was down to nothing. It was like $3 or something. But what was cool is it was all tiny, short little chapters and short little paragraphs. So I thought, you know what? I could probably do that. And little by little, I began reading it. At that time, I didn't realize, because I couldn't read, I didn't realize I wasn't using it right. I was just reading through all the different stuff. But then, once I started to get better, I read how to use the Chinese Book of Change. That changed my life. That's what Jung used to tap into his intuition, but he didn't use that till he was an adult. I've been using it since I was about 14. I've been using it for almost as long as Confucius wished he could spend studying the Chinese Book of Change. I've been studying it for over 35 years. And it's the same idea. It's this depth that's missing in our everyday world. And it's not like the one guy at ARC said, we don't need more Greek readers. We just need more readers. I think I've proven it. I started by reading short, simple stuff. And that has evolved into, in fact, there was the booktubers. There was a booktuber who has his identity as he likes to read big, hard books. But when he was commenting on some of my book reviews, his comments would be like, holy gee, you really do like big, hard books. Like they're just too big and too hard for him. But never have I seen these books as big or as hard. As I said, when I see a book that's 30 or 40 hours long, it doesn't intimidate me. That makes me super happy. Super happy. Right? Like Ian McGilchrist's, his Master and Emissary. Right? I accidentally remembered it as being 52 hours long. You want to know why? Because I listened to it that long. If you take a look at my Libby account, it actually tracks it. It kind of breaks. Libby does not, and this kind of proves that not enough people are rereading books. Because if you reread a book in Libby, it just cracks. It doesn't have the ability to tell you that unless they've changed it in the last few years, it would always say 100%. You could reread like the McGilchrist book. I think it's 26 or 27 hours long. I read it at least twice. Many of the chapters back and forth. I have hundreds of bookmarks, digital bookmarks. But Libby, when you look at the times, it says like you've listened to this for 50 hours, but it says, you're at 100%. Like it doesn't show. That to me, I think, is a sign that we're not engaging with this stuff deeply when our apps actually can't even handle this level. Like same as the audiobook app I use. It is hands down one of the most popular, one of the most robust. It's an open source app, but it regularly cannot handle the amount of audiobooks that I have. And I'm not just collecting them. Some of my physical books I'm collecting, but no, my audiobooks I listen to, and I listen to over and over again, right? And that's becoming difficult now too, because this audiobook app doesn't take that into account. So if I listen to a book to the end and I start reading it again, there's no note that I've read it already. In fact, I ran into that in Libby. AI recommended that I listen to Ellen Langer's mindfulness, learning of mindfulness or whatever it was. I forgot that I'd already read it. I mean, I love Ellen Langer, but there ain't much in that. That's why I didn't really remember it. But Libby didn't tell me till after I already borrowed it. And after I borrowed it, it said, oh, you read this book 100% and you listened to it. Like for me, it's never usually the full, except for with McGilchrist, right? For me, with Ellen Langer's book, I can't remember what it's 9 hours long. So I probably spent about 7.5 hours in it. But that is close to me listening to it twice. Because I listen to almost everything now at about 2 times speed. That's my default. If it's a little more complicated, I'll slow it down to 1.5, 1.75 times. But if it's your average, schlock, self-help, psychology, I can hit 3.3 times speed, right? Yeah. What's his name there? That's someone I can give you an example of. Duhigg. The guy talks about productivity and stuff. Yeah, I regularly listen to his books at 3 times speed, right? But I digress. So back to the podcast. So, proof it works. College mutual fund test. I walked. Well, first it took me weeks to study, again, because there was no audiobook. I had used the textbook. I had 2 jobs. I was late getting there on the bus. I was first in, first out. And the lady, when I called for my mark, said that it was the highest mark she'd ever seen on the mutual fund course. That's the Institute of Canadian Bankers. I can't remember what they called themselves at the time. So this wasn't This is not like it was college kids. Like that room that I went in to do the test, they were all adults, bankers, bank managers, investment advisors. And imagine this, college kid popping in late, popping out early. They must have assumed I flunked, but imagine. But of course, knowing me by now, I was far too skeptical to take that as, confidence. Right? And, or how about my recent CDL renewal? My AZ license, tractor trailer driver. I can drive just about everything with wheels. And I had to do my rewrite recently, and since we've had a lot of trouble here in Canada in the last few years, they have added exponentially more questions that you have to know. And what's terrible is out of 60, but they're pulling 60 questions from hundreds of questions that you need to know the answers to. So yes, I studied and I studied and I studied, and I had a hard time, no physical book, because again, they're switching to all digital, same as the why I can't drive truck. Because when I went through to become a truck driver, they said, oh no, if you're dyslexic, you can keep a physical log. Guess what? Not true. Within 6 months to a year of me putting in all this money and time, they changed that rule, and now everyone has to use a digital log. Right? Before, they were even saying that, oh, you can do an audio log. No, they took all that away. Right? But I got 59 out of 60. And you'll never believe why. It's the exact same thing as that TED Talk by the doctor who is dyslexic. He had a teacher who thought he cheated because he got such a high mark. So he forced him to redo the test verbally. And he got all of them right. You know what happened to me? When I went to the counter to do my renewal and all and find out all that, what's processed next. Do you know that I only got one wrong? So of course I asked him, I'm like, which one? And, he read the question to me and I knew the answer. So it's the exact same thing. But I mentioned that to him, and then he proceeds to say, oh, well, you can actually listen to the tests. Oh, thanks for not telling everyone that when they come in, eh? Thanks for telling us that after the fact. Like, if it had cost me $100 and I failed and had to redo it, would you have given me my $100? I didn't say any of this, but I just said, oh, wow, thanks. But in my head, I'm like, oh, thanks for telling us, eh? Right? So, long story short, I misrun because I misread. Right? The bank. I caught crooks while they were trying to drown me in forms. Maryanne Wolf says we're losing deep reading to screens. She's half right. Her dyslexic son got art, not audiobooks. She missed the boat. Me, I went from illiterate to out-talking PhDs, not just knowledge, but insight. I've read Nietzsche's Raw Notebooks, 2 volumes, then Will to Power. Most fake it. I don't. I've read everything Nietzsche's ever written. In fact, I've read quite a bit into his workbooks and stuff too. I've read everything that Jung has ever written, but not just to tick it off. I spent an entire summer in Jung's Red Book. I have read it, listened to it, I guess I should say, because again, who could afford to buy that book? I have listened to it more times than I can count. And as an example, I even corrected AI because there was someone talking about it. They took a course with Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson never mentioned this. And he's like, oh, I wonder what Jung thought of Nietzsche. And I'm like, he says it multiple times. He adored Nietzsche. He thought it was foundational to his thinking and his philosophy. Imagine, Jordan Peterson calls himself a Jungian and a Nietzschean, does a course, doesn't even teach that. And the student didn't even know, didn't even look into it, says, I wonder. I give the answer. Why? Because I actually read it. Even ChatGPT got it wrong, right? In fact, a better example is ChatGPT was completely wrong about, I was trying to remember a passage in the Bible where it talks about how God brought the religion of Abraham to the Gentiles to make the Jews jealous because they broke the covenant so many times. And I asked AI, I couldn't remember where in the Old Testament this was. And it said, no, that's Romans. It's not in the Old Testament. And I pushed back a little bit, but then finally, okay, fine, I was wrong. So I said, so what? I was misremembering. I conflated the Pauls with something in the Bible. And then the AI is like, well, not really. There's this passage and this passage. And I'm like, dude, that's the passage I was asking for. Like, what a terrible waste of time this is. 100%. It is in multiple places. But imagine, right? We wouldn't call that a hallucination, would we? That's just a pure, utter mistake. But, so a new prompt. I want to add a quick, when... No, it's asking me to flex this shit. That's not what I'm here for. I'm not looking to flex. What I'm looking to do is to share some insights so that maybe we can learn from our mistakes, from my mistakes, and maybe I can learn from your mistakes, right? Not looking to flex anything here. If anything else, I find this to have been a wholly Kafkaesque experience. I mean, I call it the theater of the absurd, our modern world theater of the absurd, because it absolutely makes no sense at all. But I progress. And I digress. So this ain't about philosophy or ancient temples. It's a lifetime. Dyslexia is not a curse. It's a forge, a crucible that I've been created within. My protocol, audio first, text after, speed up, reread, fight for it, turn struggle into strength. Science forgot dual coding. I didn't. Kids need this. Heck, you need this. Stop skimming. Prove the doubters wrong. I did. Now, I'm. What? Oh, he just tried to make a joke. He says, now I'm, at 3 times speed, sipping mint tea and laughing at the PhDs who can't keep up. There's another example. AI is terrible at these jokes. It really is. So, my outro. That's me. This is Al. Share this if it hits, right? I appreciate you. So thank you for your time.